Hey everyone, this is Murph, and in today's video, we are going to be discussing the Frost Mage rework going into Midnight. Now, I had the opportunity to get invited into the alpha, so I've been able to play and mess around and see how it feels. So I wanted to give you guys a breakdown of my initial thoughts and impressions on the spec so far. But I want to preface this video by saying that this is very early on in the alpha development stage, so a lot of the stuff that you're going to see is subject to change and most likely will change. But I think that with the right feedback, we can help Blizzard kind of steer the spec to get it into a really good position for when the game actually fully releases. So, with that said, you're either going to love this or you're going to hate it. But either way, let's cover it. Okay, so first and foremost, we have a brand new mechanic to Frost called Freeze and Shatter. This might not sound new, but it completely replaces our Shatter gameplay that we've been used to ever since vanilla World of Warcraft, where Shatter would massively increase our chance to critically strike against frozen targets. So you could constantly force spells to crit via Winter's Chill or by freezing enemies, and that would be things like Glacial Spike, Comet Storm, Ice Lance, Ray of Frost. We would be able to force those to crit all the time. That core component of Shatter is now gone. And basically what we do now is by using our rotational spells and abilities, a majority of our spells are going to be applying freezing stacks to the target up to a cap of 20. And a couple of our other spells, primarily Ice Lance, are going to be consuming freezing stacks to shatter and to basically pop them. And it's pretty similar to how Unholy Death Knight Festering Wounds works. They pretty much took that gameplay from Unholy Death Knight and they gave it to Frost Mage. So again, we're going to be building up freezing stacks and we're going to be consuming them to pop them for big shatter damage. So what this looks like, if we go ahead and just start hitting the target dummy here, by casting our main spells and abilities, Glacial Spikes, Flurries, Ray of Frost, we're going to be building freezing stacks on the target. It is a debuff that stacks up, and it goes all the way up to a cap of 20. You're going to be primarily using Ice Lance to pop multiple stacks of freezing to shatter the target. So this is going to be our core gameplay here, and a majority of your damage is going to come from these shatter stacks and popping as many shatters as you constantly can. This kind of gameplay, especially as Spellslinger, leads to a lot of Ice Lance spam because you are basically only using Ice Lance to pop Shatter. And another thing to also keep in mind is that Ice Lance itself really isn't going to be doing a lot of damage. Ice Lance is just a button that we have now that is used to pop freezing. So as you guys will see, I'll throw off an Ice Lance. It only hits for about 2,000 damage, but it pops the Shatter, and the Shatter is where the majority of our damage is going to be coming from. So there's a couple of other spells that can consume freezing stacks. One of those is Comet Storm. We still have this as a Frost Mage. However, on the alpha, Comet Storm doesn't seem to be working properly right now, at least from when I tested yesterday and earlier today. Basically, Comet Storm is supposed to replace your Blizzard button after you cast Ray of Frost. So Blizzard will turn into Comet Storm, and you're going to be able to press Comet Storm. They basically combine them into a singular button. I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about that, but I haven't been able to test Comet Storm. Again, like I said, it isn't working properly on the alpha right now. So when it is, I'll record some gameplay of it and I'll definitely show you guys how all these interactions work. So each Comet from Comet Storm says that it will shatter 2 stacks of freezing. And so since Comet Storm summons 7 meteors, that's going to be 14 stacks of freezing that Comet Storm is going to be able to shatter and pop. So a pain point that I've run into with freezing stacks is that they seem to function pretty similarly to how combo points functioned for rogues back in the day, where since freezing is a debuff that you apply to enemies, if you have, say, 10, 15 freezing stacks on a target and the enemy dies, those freezing stacks are going to just completely disappear. They don't transfer currently to a new target. There's no talent that you can take to make that happen. You just essentially lose out on all those freezing stacks, so you lose out on a lot of potential damage. So what this means is currently, if you know a target is about to die, you need to spam Ice Lance on them to get the most value out of popping all the shatter so that you don't lose out on those freezing stacks. What this also means is that if you use Ray of Frost on a low health enemy, since Ray of Frost and our Apex talents are going to be applying so many stacks of freezing, if you use Ray of Frost on an enemy right before it dies, you're going to have, upwards of 20 freezing stacks just completely go to waste that you're not going to be able to burn through before the target dies. So I would like to see some sort of mechanic or maybe a talent that would cause freezing to jump from one target to another if the primary target dies, so that those freezing stacks aren't just completely going to waste. And since the old version of Shatter is gone, we can no longer force a lot of our spells to crit. So things like Glacial Spike and Ice Lance, Ray of Frost, we're no longer going to be able to apply Winter's Chill or, naturally freeze enemies with things like Frost Nova. So as you guys will see here, if I Frost Nova this target and I cast a Glacial Spike into it, I'm not going to be gaining benefit from massively increased chance to crit against frozen targets. So that is something that, as I've played around on the alpha, that I've noticed that I miss a lot. One of the most fun things about Frost to me was being able to force as many spells as I possibly could to benefit from Shatter and crit. So my Glacial Spikes were always critting, Comet Storm and Meteor were always critting, Ray of Frost was always critting, and Ice Lances were critting, again, a majority of the time. And that doesn't really happen anymore, so it really makes our actual button presses not feel super impactful. Like I was saying, a majority of our damage comes from Shatter stacks being consumed. And so our actual spells and abilities really don't feel like they do a lot of damage. As you guys can see, I'm shooting off Frostbolts and Flurries, and now that we're up to 14 freezing stacks, I'll go ahead and throw off some Ice Lances. The Ice Lances really don't do a lot of damage, and when we get our 5th Icicle here, I'll go ahead and cast a Glacial Spike. You guys will see it really doesn't do all that much damage either, and luckily, they both crit there, but that was just chance. There isn't any sort of modifier that we can use anymore to try and guarantee that those spells are going to be crits. So a couple of key talents that we have right now in the War Within are staying with us going into Midnight, but a lot of them have had their functionality changed to accommodate this new gameplay style. So that would include things like Fractured Frost. So this talent reads that your Ice Lance's Fracture on impact, dealing frost damage to up to 3 additional freezing enemies, and damage from Fractured Frost shatters. So this means that Fractured Frost is going to be popping Shatter in AoE on multiple targets at the same time, so up to 4 enemies. What that's going to look like is if I'm sitting here and applying freezing stacks to multiple enemies in an AoE or a cleave situation, if I am to build up a bunch of freezing stacks on both targets, if I Ice Lance my primary target, you'll see that it consumes freezing stacks on both of these targets with freezing. So we have a way to kind of pop Shatter in AoE now just by Ice Lancing on a primary target. We're also keeping certain talents like Splitting Ice, but again, this one has had its functionality changed a little bit. So instead of Ice Lance and Glacial Spike and Icicles benefiting from cleaving onto another nearby target, Splitting Ice is now going to affect Flurry and Frostbolt. So as you guys will see, I think these targets are a little too far away for Frostbolt to cleave, but what you'll notice is that Glacial Spike and Flurry will cleave. So it just changes the functionality of which spells are going to be cleaving. So now our 2 main filler spells that apply freezing can hit a nearby target so that you're able to, pretty efficiently spread your freezing onto 2 nearby targets if you happen to be playing this talent. Another little quality of life change that Blizzard has made for us is the introduction of Blizzard into the Frost talent tree. So we now get to choose between 2 different forms of Blizzard, one of which will be your regular Blizzard where you press the spell and you target on the ground where you want it to go, or we have the option of having Blizzard cast at your target's location. So this is very similar to how Rain of Fire works for Destruction Warlocks, how Earthquake works for Elemental Shamans. So you're able to, if you want, have Blizzard just be cast directly on top of your target, where you don't need to target it anywhere specifically on the ground. You don't need to have an @cursor macro if you don't want. Your mouse can be anywhere on your screen, and it will always drop Blizzard directly on top of your target. So if you want, you can feel free to play with this talent. Again, it kind of removes the need to have an @cursor location macro if you don't feel like playing with something like that. So again, nice little change here, and I love to see things like this added. One of the biggest losses in Midnight for Frost Mage is the removal of Icy Veins. Now, after a couple hours of playing in the alpha, I absolutely noticed the lack of this cooldown because we've had Icy Veins ever since the beginning of Burning Crusade. So it has been 17, 18 plus years since we've had Icy Veins, and they've completely removed it from the spec. So it feels like a core spell, a core iconic ability is just completely gone. And it feels like the spec is incomplete without it. It always felt good to have a spell that you press that kind of amps your character up. You get a lot of haste. Your spells are flying off much faster. Your rotation is happening a lot quicker. It always felt really good to press. So I'm definitely noticing the lack of Icy Veins, and I'm going to remain optimistic and hopeful that Blizzard is able to get the spec into a really good spot without it. But I personally would love to see the re-inclusion of Icy Veins, as I personally don't think that Icy Veins would really impact the new gameplay style of Frost in any real negative way. So with the removal of Icy Veins, Blizzard's intention is to have Ray of Frost be our primary cooldown now. So I have a couple of concerns with Ray of Frost. Firstly, Ray of Frost is a channeled ability, which means that you can accidentally cancel your cast early and lose out on a lot of damage. So, because Ray of Frost has a really long channel time, if you start casting Ray of Frost and there's a mechanic that happens that forces you to move, you can cancel this early and you lose out on a ton of damage straight up from Ray of Frost, but you also miss out on a ton of potential freezing stacks, which then results in a loss of shatter damage. So casting Ray of Frost is something that you're going to have to plant your feet and just kind of sit there and hope that you don't have to move. Luckily, we still have Shimmer as a mage, but you might not always have Shimmer available, and you might accidentally cancel your Ray of Frost early, so that feels really, really bad. There was, however, a data mine spell for Frost Mage specifically, which is Ice Flows, and we don't know exactly how this talent is going to function yet, but I'm hopeful that this talent is going to imply that passively we're just going to be able to cast Ray of Frost on the move. Now, I would personally love if Ray of Frost just had the ability to be cast while moving passively baked into the spell, and maybe get another different talent point instead of having to expend a point into another talent just so we get the functionality to make this cooldown not feel so poor. So with Ray of Frost becoming our new primary cooldown, Blizzard has put a lot of emphasis on this spell feeling really powerful. However, there are a couple of things about this spell, as I mentioned, that I would like to maybe see improved on. And firstly, that would be the ability to cast Ray of Frost while we're moving so that we can't accidentally cancel it if we are forced to move or if we accidentally move our character. And I would also like to potentially see a stronger animation for Ray of Frost, as the current animation looks pretty underwhelming and pretty weak, considering this is supposed to be our primary cooldown that we're using here as a Frost Mage. When I think of Ray of Frost and how I would like it to look, I think about how Jaina's Ray of Frost looks when you're fighting her in Battle of Dazar'alor back in Battle for Azeroth. It has a lot of spell visuals. It looks very powerful. I would love to maybe see an updated visual resembling something like that come to Frost Mage so that Ray of Frost just feels a little bit more impactful. So Ray of Frost, it is pretty similar to how you know it on the live version of the game. However, it doesn't have the ramping properties that it does on retail, where the spell, as it goes on through its channel, gets stronger and stronger. Ray of Frost is just going to hit the same amount throughout the entire duration. But more importantly with Ray of Frost is it's going to apply a bunch of freezing stacks for you. So after you use Ray of Frost, you're going to be able to shatter a bunch of freezing stacks. We also have a new Apex talent called Hand of Frost, where this is going to empower Ray of Frost to send out some Hands of Frost, and these hands are going to apply additional freezing stacks, which we will get into here shortly. But whenever you cast Ray of Frost with all of your talents and your Apex talents, you're essentially going to always get up to about 20 stacks of freezing. So if I'm to cast Ray of Frost here and let the entire channel go through, as you guys will see, we're gaining freezing stacks really quickly, and we're all the way up to 20. So now we're able to kind of just shoot off a bunch of Ice Lances, consume a bunch of these freezing stacks to proc some shatter damage, and do a decent amount of straight up burst damage. So like I mentioned, we have a new Apex talent here called Hand of Frost, and this reads that shattering an enemy has a 10% chance to summon a Hand of Frost to pursue your target, dealing frost damage and applying 2 stacks of freezing on contact. So this is basically just a passive way for you to gain extra freezing stacks just by casting spells, shattering primarily through Ice Lance. However, our capstone talent here for Hand of Frost reads Ray of Frost summons 4 Hands of Frost over its duration, and additionally Ray of Frost gains an additional charge with extra damage. So, because Hand of Frost generates 2 stacks of freezing, and Ray of Frost is going to summon 4 Hands of Frost throughout its duration, that means that we are going to be gaining 8 stacks of freezing via Hands of Frost, on top of the 8 stacks of freezing that Ray of Frost naturally is going to be giving us. So just by casting Ray of Frost, we're going to be getting 16 stacks of freezing. And if you play Spellslinger, you have a bunch of ways to be shooting off splinters that have a chance to generate freezing stacks for you every time that a splinter deals direct damage. And so most likely every single time that we press Ray of Frost, we're going to be getting maximum freezing stacks. So again, what this is going to look like is when I press Ray of Frost, it will be generating freezing stacks, and I'm going to be summoning Hands of Frost that will be crawling towards the target, exploding on contact, applying even more freezing, and then we're going to have splinters flying off that also have a chance to apply freezing. I do think that the Hand of Frost visual is kind of bugged out right now, so you can't always see it happening. But if I go ahead and press Ray of Frost, as you guys will see, freezing stacks are going up and up and up and up. And as my cast is complete, we are all the way up to 20 freezing stacks. So I'm able to just kind of send off a bunch of Ice Lances, consume a bunch of these to deal a bunch of shatter damage to the target. Next up, we have the return of our permanent water elemental pet. So if any of you guys ever played a Frost Mage back in Mists of Pandaria, Warlords of Draenor, around that era, you'll remember we had a permanent water elemental pet. So he has returned. We do have the water elemental back to assist us when we're fighting. However, I do have some concerns about the current iteration of the water elemental because as it stands in the alpha right now, the water elemental is pretty much entirely passive. So if you're playing Spellslinger, we have a couple of talents that generate freezing stacks from conjuring splinters, and our splinters dealing direct damage. So we have a talent in the Spellslinger tree called Attuned Familiar, which reads, your water elemental has a 50% chance to conjure a splinter alongside its water bolt. So water bolt is just your water elemental's auto attack, basically. So it has a 50% chance to summon a splinter. On top of that, we have another talent here called Infused Splinters, which reads, direct damage from frost splinters has a 25% chance to apply 1 stack of freezing. So what this means is if I have my water elemental just hitting the target, it's going to cast Water Jet here because that is just a passive ability. But while it's casting water bolts, it has a small chance for me to summon a splinter. And that splinter has an even smaller chance to generate a stack of freezing on the target. So it's not a lot. It doesn't happen very frequently, but you do have a very, very, very small chance to generate 1 extra stack of freezing every now and then. As you guys can see, I'm shooting off splinters and I haven't even gained a singular stack of freezing. And so it's kind of underwhelming. It really doesn't proc all that often. There we go. We finally got 1 stack of freezing there after, you know, about 10 casts of Water Bolt. So again, very passive, hard to notice, especially when a bunch of your other spells are generating stacks of freezing all the time. Again, just feels a little bit underwhelming. Now, our water elemental retains 2 of its abilities that it has pretty much always had, and that is our ranged freeze ability and water jet. Now, neither of these really have any interaction with our character, our procs, anything like that. If any of you guys played a Frost Mage back in the day when we used to have a permanent water elemental pet, you might remember that our ranged freeze ability would generate Fingers of Frost stacks depending on how many targets we hit. So if I hit 2 targets with freeze, I would be generating 2 Fingers of Frost charges. Now, when I use freeze on enemies, I don't generate anything. So freeze is just a flat out ranged route, nothing more than that. I would love to possibly see the return of gaining Fingers of Frost procs from using our pet's freeze ability, since again, we have him up permanently and we're gonna wanna be using freeze as a utility ability. It would be nice to be able to gain some additional benefit from that spell. And lastly, as I mentioned, we still have Water Jet for our water elemental. However, on the alpha, it doesn't generate any procs. It doesn't really do anything aside from just channeling damage on your primary target. Again, this is another ability that feels pretty underwhelming, especially when you compare it to the live version of our water elemental, where when we summon it via Icy Veins, when our water elemental uses Water Jet, it's going to give us a brain freeze proc. So as you guys will see here, when I use Water Jet on the target, I'm not gaining any procs. Nothing's happening with my character. It's just some small passive damage that my pet will do. And again, you know, it just feels very passive. And I would love to see more interaction with our water elemental if this is going to be a pet that we permanently have. So another really big change coming to the spec is the fact that our Icicles are no longer going to be generated by some of our rotational abilities like Frostbolt and Flurry and Ice Lances against frozen targets. Now Icicles are just going to kind of passively generate every couple of seconds. You're just going to get an Icicle. So it really takes away a lot of urgency in the spec, because on live servers, we have the ability to build up Icicles really, really fast and then shoot off Glacial Spikes, build up 5 Icicles, shoot off Glacial Spikes. But now you kind of just have a window where as soon as you get 5 Icicles, you can just press Glacial Spike. There's no real, like I said, urgency to it. It just, Glacial Spike just feels like a stronger Frostbolt now. Because Frostbolt applies freezing, and so does Glacial Spike. Glacial Spike, when you get to 5 Icicles, will replace your Frostbolt, so they merge them into a single button. So again, Glacial Spike just feels like a stronger Frostbolt proc, and we, like I mentioned earlier, lose the functionality of being able to force Glacial Spike to crit every single time that we cast it. So what you guys will see here is I'm sitting at 5 Icicles. That means that my Frostbolt has turned into Glacial Spike. If I cast Glacial Spike, it's going to shoot off and apply some freezing stacks to the target. And as you guys will see, as I'm casting Frostbolts and shooting out Flurries, I'm not generating Icicles. I kind of just gain an Icicle every couple of seconds. So Icicles are just entirely passive now. I don't even really think about them when I'm running around doing things on the alpha. It just, whenever I get to 5 Icicles, my Frostbolt lights up and turns into Glacial Spike, and I'm basically just shooting off an empowered Frostbolt. It doesn't really feel super impactful. It takes away a lot of the fun of the ability from Glacial Spike. Again, it just feels entirely passive now. And what I would maybe like to see done to Glacial Spike is turn it into an ability that instead of generating freezing stacks, I would love to see Glacial Spike consume freezing stacks and maybe add the functionality of having Glacial Spike always crit, kind of like a Chaos Bolt. Because as a Frost Mage, our core gameplay for the past couple of expansions has revolved around forcing Glacial Spike to crit. So when you cast a Glacial Spike and it doesn't crit, it feels really, really underwhelming. Again, we're getting pretty lucky here and my Glacial Spikes are both critting, but again, that is just chance and my critical strike chance is high enough to where we're getting lucky. But again, like I said, shooting off Glacial Spikes that don't crit is pretty underwhelming. So I would maybe like to see Glacial Spike be its own button again and only usable again at 5 Icicles to shatter and consume freezing stacks. And maybe, like I said, add the functionality of always having this ability crit. All right, next up, we have a change that I have been wanting ever since the introduction of this spell back in Mists of Pandaria, and that is the fact that our Frozen Orb is now going to track your primary target. So what this means is when you throw out a Frozen Orb, whatever your primary target is at the time, after a second or two, the Frozen Orb is going to reverse direction and it is going to kind of stick to your primary target, similar to how Entropic Rift works for Voidweaver Priests, if you guys have played or seen how that ability works in the live version of the game. So what this is going to look like is if I'm right next to this target, Frozen Orb always has a minimum distance that it will travel outwards from your character before it slows down. So what you guys will see is I'm going to throw out my Frozen Orb. It's going to travel outwards, and after a second or two, it's going to reverse direction and kind of gravitate towards the primary target. So again, I'll throw out Frozen Orb, and if you guys notice, the orb will reverse direction and it will follow my primary target. So what this means is gone are the days of tanks running out of your Frozen Orbs like they're a harmful spell or ability, avoiding all your damage. Because one of my biggest gripes with Frost Mage over the years was the fact that most of our AoE abilities were ground targeted abilities. So Blizzard, Comet Storm, and Frozen Orb, which means that they had the potential to miss, especially if your tank was kiting mobs around or was just moving around a lot. That always felt really bad. So now our Frozen Orb is going to stick to our primary target, so we should have a lot more uptime on our orbs. Another core mage ability that we have always had as a Frost Mage, dating all the way back to Vanilla WoW, is a spell called Cold Snap, which would be a spell that you activate to reset the cooldown of a lot of your main Frost utility defensive abilities. So that's things like Ice Block and Ice Barrier. So Cold Snap is gone. However, Blizzard has given Ice Cold or Ice Block and Ice Barrier a second charge. So now we no longer have to use Ice Cold and then use Cold Snap to reset it to be able to use it again. Same with Ice Barrier. We just have 2 stacks of each now. So you can use these, freely without having to worry about pressing Cold Snap to reset them. But just keep in mind with Ice Cold or Ice Block, you still have hypothermia, so you're not gonna be able to just use these back to back. You'll still get this debuff, but it is nice removing the middleman of having to press Cold Snap to then be able to reuse your abilities. Another issue that I have noticed with Frost currently in the Midnight Alpha is also an issue that we are currently facing on the live version of the game in War Within. If you're playing Frostfire as a Frost Mage, on the live servers, our mastery stat does not impact any of the damage instances that come from Frostfire. So that's things like our Pyroblast and Ignite from our tier set bonus, as well as Meteor, Frostfire Burst, Frostfire Infusion. None of those gain any benefit from mastery, but they do gain benefit and extra damage from versatility. So as a Frostfire Frost Mage, we tend to avoid mastery because it really doesn't impact us that much. We want more versatility, so we avoid mastery, which doesn't feel very good trying to just completely avoid a stat like that. Going into Midnight, Blizzard has reworked our mastery to be freeze and shatter. However, again, we run into pretty much the same issue here where pretty much most things in the Frostfire tree do not benefit from freeze or shatter. A lot of these things do not apply freezing. A lot of them do not benefit from shatter. Things like our Pyroblast that are going to be shot out whenever we cast a Glacial Spike. This has no interaction with freeze or shatter. Ignite has no interaction. Frostfire Infusion has no interaction. So there's a lot of things in here that just do not gain any benefit from our mastery. And so it's looking like if you play Frostfire, you're still going to want to avoid mastery, at least in this current iteration of Frost on the alpha. Again, something to note, I haven't really been able to fully test out Frostfire because Comet Storm currently isn't working properly here on the alpha, and Comet Storm is a big contributing factor into how Frostfire plays because Comet Storm is going to be summoning meteors through isothermic core. But since Comet Storm isn't working, I'm not able to test Frostfire out properly right now. So whenever that's fixed, I'll hop in and I will record some gameplay and we'll make a video about Frostfire. But again, unable to fully test this, so it might feel a little bit different once the spec is fully functional. And if it does, I will let you guys know. So going into Midnight, we are losing the need to track things like Winter's Chill since we no longer have it. We don't really need to track our Icicles since they just kind of generate passively on their own. And we are losing things like Excess Frost and Excess Fire as a Frostfire Mage. So a lot of these things that we need weak auras for to be able to track and, be aware of at all times, we no longer have to worry about any of that stuff. However, our focus is now shifted from maintaining buffs and stacks to maintaining a debuff. So I feel like as I'm playing in the alpha, 90% of the time, my attention is focused strictly on looking at my freezing debuff and being aware of how many stacks of freezing that I have. So as you guys will see, as I'm hitting targets and we're generating freezing, I've noticed that pretty much, again, feels like 80-90% of the time, I'm just looking right here at this debuff and making sure that I'm not hitting 20 and that I have enough stacks to shatter to get the most value out of shooting off an Ice Lance. And so it feels like I'm not really focusing on actually playing the game. I'm more focusing on just maintaining a debuff. And this might be something that you enjoy, but personally, I've found that it has been taking away a lot of the enjoyment from actually playing the game for me because I feel like I'm just playing a debuff instead. All in all, I'm remaining optimistic about the changes to Frost going into Midnight. I have been having fun playing around with the new gameplay style of Frost, but it's definitely not without its pain points. The removal of Icy Veins is definitely noticeable, and the shift to Ray of Frost as our primary cooldown currently feels pretty clunky. But I think with the right changes, this could end up feeling pretty good. Freeze and Shatter as a mechanic is a complete switch up from what we've been used to with Frost in recent years, as we can no longer force our spells to crit via normal Shatter crit multipliers, and we're now completely reliant on building and spending a debuff on enemies. Freeze as a debuff seems to run into similar issues that rogues used to have with combo points, where if a target dies with freezing stacks still on them, these stacks are completely lost. This playstyle feels similar to Unholy Death Knight's wound gameplay, so if you're not a big fan of that playstyle, you might not enjoy this one as much. However, we do apply freezing at a much faster rate than DKs could have ever applied wounds. As it currently stands, the gameplay of Frost seems to revolve very heavily around spamming Ice Lance, as I can run into situations where I am spamming 10 Ice Lances back to back trying to expend all of my freezing stacks. I would like to see some changes made where we have more options to use to consume freezing, such as Glacial Spike consuming multiple stacks and thus being a guaranteed critical strike when doing so. The lack of natural cooldown reduction for Frozen Orb via our Blizzard is also heavily noticeable, especially for Frostfire. However, Comet Storm is not currently working for me on the alpha, so the AoE feels particularly bad. This might be different once I'm able to properly test out the hero talent fully though. Water Elemental is a cool reintroduction to the spec. However, it currently feels very passive, and I would like to see some more interaction via its spells, with things like Freeze possibly granting us Fingers of Frost, and Water Jet potentially giving us a Brain Freeze proc as it does on live. Leave a comment down below with your thoughts on the Frost Mage rework going into Midnight, and let me know what changes you guys would like to see Blizzard make throughout the course of the alpha and beta cycle to help get Frost into a really good spot. And come check out my Twitch page so you guys can catch me playing the alpha live, testing out a bunch of different classes and specs. I'll leave a link to that down in the description. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Peace out.